Welcome everyone to the next panel in the ThinkTent here. In deference to an extremely crowded schedule and a very crowded room, I think we should get started now. Thanks very much for joining us today here in this panel on UK foreign policy after Brexit. I'm Ted Bromund, Senior Research Fellow in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Just a few quick words on Heritage. Heritage is the largest conservative think tank in the United States. We have about 500,000 individual members. We're proud to be the home of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, created by Lady Thatcher as her American memorial. We've sponsored a panel at the Conservative Party conference every year since 2013, and we're delighted to be returning again this year. Of course, we were remote last year, thanks to COVID. Personally, it's great to be back in the UK for the first time in 2 years. This is the longest time between my visits to the UK since 1987, which really puts it in perspective. It's great to be back after 2 years of Conservative government. Things are incredibly changed. Not only is Brexit done, but The Guardian is even asking why people aren't buying more petrol, which I think is phenomenal. One of our top priorities at the Heritage Foundation is the US-UK free trade area. We see this as a vital Brexit opportunity. But of course, foreign policy is about far more than just trade, and foreign policy, of course, goes well beyond Brexit. So this year, we wanted to look at that larger picture, informed undoubtedly by the release of the Integrated Review back in March 2021. We've got 3 distinguished panelists here to present their perspectives, after which we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. Speaking first, Andrew Rosindell, MP for Romford and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Speaking second, Alexander Downer, Chairman of the Trustees of Policy Exchange, Australian Foreign Minister from 1996 to 2007, and High Commissioner to the UK from 2014 to 2018. And rounding up and bringing us back to the UK, Sophia Gaston, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, an independent and nonpartisan think tank that seeks to strengthen the UK's international engagement. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Ted, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation. For many decades, the Heritage Foundation has been a bastion of conservative thinking in the United States, but also feeding their ideas over to the United Kingdom. I went to the United States for the first time in 1986, and I was hosted by the magnificent Heritage Foundation, who then established the Margaret Thatcher Center several years later. And of course, in 1986, we had a truly conservative president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. I remember going to the White House in 1986 as a young conservative, and I pressed the buzzer. Can you believe that? I pressed the buzzer on the door of the White House, the back door, and asked to see President Reagan's secretary. And she said, well, I can see you for a minute, but the president can't, I'm afraid. But what he did do is to send me a wonderful signed photograph of Ronald Reagan, personally to me. And that meant a huge amount. As a young conservative in those days, having lived through the Cold War, having seen the leadership that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher showed, inspired me to go on further into politics and to fight for the values of freedom, liberty, and democracy that those 2 great statesmen stood for. The freedom we have today is not free, ladies and gentlemen. It's had to be fought for. We've had to work for it, and we must defend it and cherish it going forward. Freedom can be lost. It can be taken away if we don't guard it and protect it. And so that is why freedom can only be protected if we as a nation are free to choose what we do as a nation. And that is now made possible by being unshackled from the grip of the European Union and those people in Brussels who thought, foolishly, that the British people would permanently concede to rule from the European Union? Well, we had a better idea, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we are a proud, free and independent nation once again. And when we talk about proud, free and independent nations, there's another country that was never taken in by the lure of Brussels, and that is Switzerland. I'm delighted to welcome the new Swiss ambassador to the United Kingdom. Ambassador, you're very welcome. Now, that's a country we can learn a lot from, a country that understands that freedom and liberty and centuries-old democracy actually means something. It's not something we should sign away as a treaty with other countries to gain some kind of trade advantage, which is the way it was presented to us when we joined the so-called common market. Well, we're out and we're never going back. And the opportunities for Britain are vast. It means we can dictate what we do in our own country, but also work to build greater friendships for trade and cooperation around the world without being tied to others holding a sword of Damocles over us. We are free to make our own choices once again. And nothing is more important than to work to build free trade and free enterprise between the UK and our friends around the world. We are, ladies and gentlemen, historically and always have been a free trading, seafaring nation. We've never shied away from trading across the globe, and now we can be free to do it again. And where better to start than one of our closest countries, the most friendliest country to us, the one we have the most in common with. And of course, I'm going to talk about our good friends in Australia. The first free trade agreement. What better country to start that process of having free trade agreements around the world? But we must reignite, I believe, the strength and the passion and the belief of what I would call the Britannic peoples. We've got a proud history. Our forebears sailed around the world, they set up colonies, they assisted other parts of the world to trade and cooperate and adopt modern ways of science and medicine. We spread our Christian heritage to countries far and wide, whilst respecting people of other cultures. Of course we did. But we must harness that again. That's part of our psyche. That's part of who we were. That's what our forebears did. And they did it with pride. And they did it for good reasons. So never be ashamed of British history. Never do it down. I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm not saying we as a nation have always got it right. But we have a proud record in standing up for the freedom and liberties and the democracy and the rule of law and all the things that we must cherish and guard for the future. And our extended British family is not just within the UK, but our overseas territories, Crown dependencies, and of course, the Commonwealth family. I'm delighted we have the leader of the Conservatives of Bermuda here today, Cole. One Bermuda Alliance. Bermuda is a proud British overseas territory that choose to remain under the Crown and part of our great British family. So we must include them as well in everything we do to extend freedom, free enterprise and global cooperation. There is only one party in this nation, ladies and gentlemen, who would do that, and that is, of course, our Conservative Party. We have to be bold. We have to be radical, just as Margaret Thatcher knew we had to be in the 1980s, so we must be again. Only by being bold and determined, by being strong, principled, and focused on where we're heading as a nation, can we build back better. And ladies and gentlemen, I know we can build back greater. We are a great nation, and we will always be so. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for coming here today. I look forward to the other panellists. I would say one final thing to you. It was 25 years ago that Margaret Thatcher addressed a wonderful event in London, hosted by the European Young Conservatives and the International Young Democrat Union. These are our sister parties, sister organisations around the world. And she said at the Britannia Hotel in London that our task was to re-preach, practice and earn anew the freedom that we have and that we must extend more widely across the world. We must be, ladies and gentlemen, the party and the nation that spreads that freedom far and wide. That is our task. That is our duty. Let's get to it.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Alexander.
Thanks, Ted, very much, and it's a great privilege to be able to speak on this panel, and in particular to support the Heritage Foundation, which is such a famous and august institution which has driven, I think, a lot of very constructive public debate over many decades. I've visited it myself, and it's certainly an inspiring place there in Washington, D.C. I mentioned on an earlier panel I was on that my father was the Australian High Commissioner here in the UK between 1964 and 1972. And he found that experience a really depressing experience because he had been a great Anglophile. He loved Britain, went to university here, was called to the bar at the Inns of Court, went back to Australia after that, but he loved Britain. And he came here and he found a country which was totally enmeshed in the declinist narrative, that our best days are behind us, we have to withdraw from the world, we have to have a more modest vision about Britain and what Britain should do in the world. And during his time, the Harold Wilson government, none looking around the room, I'd be about the only person here who'd remember it. The Harold Wilson government withdrew from east of Suez, to use the expression, closed all of British military bases and presence east of the Suez Canal. And then your party, Ted Heath, joined the EEC and turned its back, to be brutal with you, on Australia, New Zealand, on the Commonwealth countries altogether. And there was a real sense amongst my father's generation that this was a true tragedy, that this once great country, the bastion of freedom in the world, of liberal democracy, the country with the so-called mother of parliaments, had decided that it only had a more introverted and regional role to play in the world. I was the Foreign Minister of Australia for 12 years, and during that time, no British Foreign Secretary ever visited Australia. That was how much the FCO cared about Australia during that period. Now, most of that period was during the Blair and Brown governments, but it was William Hague who was the first Foreign Secretary to visit Australia when he came, soon after he became the Foreign Secretary, so I suppose that was in about 2011. I think it was 2011 he came to Australia. It was the first visit to Australia in 17 years. 80% of Foreign Office ministers, taking all of the ministers, visits abroad during that period were to EU countries. So, you know, for British foreign policy, Slovakia and Slovenia, great countries that they may be, were more important than the Commonwealth of Australia. And I put it to you, that did not reflect the views of the British people, but that did reflect the view of the establishment in Westminster and Whitehall at that time. And the reason I mention all of that, and I do so very deliberately, is that I think there has been an extraordinary transformation here with this government. And in fact, I think what has happened in the last couple of years in the UK in government will be seen 20 years from now as an extraordinary transformation. A recognition of this country's huge assets, everything from the size of its economy, the fifth biggest economy in the world, as the government keeps telling us, through to its permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear weapons state, a country which I think is only exceeded in the whole world in terms of soft power by the United States of America. So, you know, you have this position that has been built up over the generations in the UK. And the question is, what is your destiny? Well, I thought between around 1964 and 2016, there was pretty much a view that your destiny was to focus on your immediate neighbourhood. And that was it. And I think that was sad, and I think the world was poorer for that. So what we're seeing now with the so-called post-Brexit global Britain is a foreign and trade policy which engages with the world as the world is, and where the UK is now beginning to leverage much more effectively the assets that it has around the world. So what is happening in the world, as you all know, is the centre of gravity is moving to the Indo-Pacific region. The centre of economic gravity, but the centre of geopolitical gravity as well. And that is something that Britain should be part of, not allow that huge change that's taking place to bypass this country, or this country to turn its back on it. And so it is with the British government. The Tory government are saying we want to build trade and economic relations more constructively with the Indo-Pacific region. Andrew's mentioned the free trade agreement with Australia. I told all the Remainers that because we in Australia have negotiated 16 free trade agreements. Free trade agreements don't take long to negotiate. They said it would take 7 or 10 years to negotiate a free trade agreement with Australia. It took 12 months. It's easily done if you want to have free trade. And that is a really high quality free trade agreement. It's going, you know, look, it's not going to transform the British or the Australian economies, but it's going to be a good little earner, as they say, a nice little earner for our two countries. So it will be good. You'll get some lovely things from Australia much more cheaply than you get them now. Much nicer things. You know, you've been depending on all that terrible European food. Imagine getting lovely, fresh Australian food, cloned from not quite next door. But I mean, to be frank, more importantly, the British government is now determined to join what's called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, a terrible mouthful. Let us call it, for the purposes of this meeting, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. 11 countries, $9 trillion worth of GDP. If the UK can succeed in getting into the TPP, and I think it will over the next couple of years, that is going to be a great boon for the British economy. That will give the UK free trade, not just with Australia, but New Zealand, of course, but with Japan and Mexico and Singapore and you know, so the list goes on. Quite a few countries, Vietnam and so on. So it will be a good thing, and it's really impressive that the UK is now trying to make something of these trade agreements, which, of course, when you were in the EU, you couldn't. And, you know, if anyone wants to ask me a question about negotiating with the EU, I'm happy to tell them what an incredibly difficult task it is to negotiate with the EU, any trade agreement at all. We have almost none in Australia because it's so difficult to negotiate with. And finally, there are the strategic issues. So I mentioned the Indo-Pacific region. What we need, though, in the Indo-Pacific region, fast-growing economies, 2/3 of the middle class over the next 20 years will emerge in the Indo-Pacific region, India, China, and so the list goes on. However, what we need in the Indo-Pacific region for this to work is stability. And what we've got to avoid is the Indo-Pacific region and other parts of the world being dominated by autocracies and tyrannies. We have to have, as Andrew was saying, all of us have to have the courage to stand up for the liberal democratic system. We have to develop now, redevelop, more confidence in the virtues of the liberal democratic system and liberal economies. We have to develop more determination to uphold it. in the teeth of opposition and alternative models being put forward. And of course, you know, let's not beat about the bush. The biggest problem here is not Russia, which is a bit of a Potemkin state, a fading nation. The big problem here is China. Now, we can make deals with China. I've myself negotiated many agreements with China over the years. We can engage with China. I'm all in favour of that. I don't believe in a policy of containment with China. But what we're not going to have is China determining the rules and the way of life of people in the Indo-Pacific region. We're not going to allow China to reduce other countries in the region and even beyond in parts of Africa, you know, even right over in the Caribbean, reduce countries to becoming client states through economic coercion. Now, you know they've had a go at Australia. They tried to, you know, cut off some of our exports to China and thought that if they stopped buying our barley, they stopped buying our wine, they stopped buying our lovely coal. Don't tell Boris I mentioned coal. That, you know, we would really suffer and we would cave into them. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We are not going to be subjected to economic coercion by anyone, and in particular by a country which is in effect a tyranny. And so we look to Britain as one of the major powers in the world to play its role in upholding the international rules-based system and freedom and democracy, the liberal democratic model in the Indo-Pacific region. And how do you do that? By participating in the architecture of the region, by being present, by being seen there. The Royal Navy, of course, every so often is now going to send task forces out into the region. Very important to do that. But the most recent agreement between Australia, the UK and the US, which will furnish Australians with nuclear-powered submarines, is a really important development in terms of the power balance in the Indo-Pacific region. And the UK is playing its part in that. So I'm sure my time is up, Ted, but I just wanted to leave you with a thought that it's good to see Britain back on the world stage. It's good to have you back. And I think the present government is, you know, it's a Conservative Party conference, and I'm a bit of a Conservative myself. I reckon you've been doing a great job. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alexander. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Ted, and thank you to you and Heritage more broadly for having me here today. So the integrated review, which was the big review that took place into the UK's foreign policy, and it's called the integrated review because it's sort of bringing together a lot of different elements. That was published earlier this year, and I just want to talk about 5 things that I think we need to be really putting at the top of the agenda now we're moving into the implementation phase of the review, which is obviously the more difficult part, moving from conception to reality. And, you know, the to-do list for the Global Britain project is absolutely enormous, and let's not beat around the bush. There are huge capacity and bandwidth issues. And we're going to have to make some tough choices about our priorities. So here are just 5 areas I think that will be pretty important. The first is around projecting our values. Now, I think we've, you know, obviously moved into an era now where we are coordinating very well with our allies, releasing statements condemning, you know, human rights abuses in China. We're using sanctions as effective instruments. But I think one of the most effective ways that we will not just project but embed our values is making sure that Britain is at the front in terms of being the architects of these new frontiers of governance. We have historical aptitude in designing frameworks of governance, and you know, it's wonderful that we're releasing strongly worded statements, but what we really should also be expending a lot of energy on is thinking about how we make sure that the AI ethics, space, the internet, the new governance frameworks that come up around these and that need to be built are built on principles of openness and transparency. So that's number one. Number two, I think, that said, we do really need to make sure that we are reinvigorating and defending the existing institutions that we have, and many of which we played a very instrumental role in creating. They are not perfect, and we can acknowledge they are not perfect, but they're also very essential safeguards, and we need to be not just sort of blithely defending what they are, we need to be actively looking at what's happening in terms of vacuums of power and how Britain can be muscling back in there. One of the reasons that China has been so effective in those institutions is because they've seen the power that they can hold. Through doing so, we must be at the table. The third point is that I really think we need to accept that while the United States will remain a vital, very close partner of ours in many ways, they will not necessarily be the centrifugal force at the heart of the Western alliance anymore. I think we have to think about a kind of plurality of power within the Western alliance. And what is Britain's role going to be within that? I think that it was quite clear in the weeks leading up to the US elections that many of our allies do look to us to step up and play a role in that kind of coordination effort. We need to understand that the social and political landscapes in pretty much every Western democracy is going to be pretty tough for at least the next decade. There are a lot of different factors at play in that. And we need to build a Western alliance that is capable of taking decisions and being effective without the United States necessarily leading from the front and without any particular dependence on any singular country. Fourth, China. Now, the challenges presented by China are unique, but they also do speak to many of the other broader challenges that we face as a nation in many aspects of our national security. And I do hope that the reflective moment that we have been having on China can lead to, can be the impetus really for a fundamental reorganization of the way in which we do our foreign policy and the machinery of government around it. We need to understand that there is a full audit to be done of all of our vulnerabilities, and they extend well beyond many of the kind of big ticket items that have traditionally fallen into our critical national infrastructure. We need to go further. It needs to be comprehensive, and we need a UK-China strategy, recognizing that, as the Integrated Review noted, this is a systemic competitor and challenge to us. And without that, we will not be able to engage with them from a more confident position, and it's totally unacceptable for us to just be constantly on the back foot. So we need to get some grip on that. And then just finally, I think, another point that was made in the Integrated Review, which I very much welcome, is this idea that we should be pursuing a whole-of-society approach to resilience. I think it's absolutely essential because our strategic rivals do not look at our vulnerabilities in sort of careful silos. We have to accept that the risks we face go beyond the traditional parameters of national security. This is about our economy. This is about our democracy. This is about our society too. So I think we need to be bringing together our domestic and international resilience strategies. I think we need to be really smart thinking about how leveling up and Global Britain work hand in hand, because ultimately the best foundation of a really confident and effective foreign policy is going to be a very strong and united nation at home. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to exercise the usual moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. I don't think we do ourselves any service here if we dodge difficult issues. I'm sort of surprised that none of the panelists mentioned Afghanistan. And I think it's important that we talk about difficult, perhaps even shameful issues. like this and not simply indulge in pleasant rhetoric about things like AUKUS, which I very much support. So perhaps I could ask all the panelists for a quick reflection on lessons to be learned from Afghanistan, and in particular, the U.S.'s abandonment of it.
Me first?
Please.
Okay. So, this is not something that we will look back on with great pride, the way the ending of the engagement of the Western allies in Afghanistan has been handled. The reason we went there was legitimate. We had a job to do. We had to deal with Al-Qaeda, get bin Laden, which eventually happened, and try to turn that country into a place that wasn't threatening us, that wasn't being used to threaten us in the West. That task was achieved. Then, of course, what happened was we were there and we wanted to make the country better as well. So mission creep, as it was called then, that crept in. Eventually, we finished up being entangled in a longer-term project, which was a laudable one. I went to Afghanistan in 2010. I met Afghanistan soldiers and policemen that were being trained by the British, and you could see that the country was being given a foundations for a better future by the UK and by others, and we should be proud of that. But we couldn't stay there forever. Eventually, we had to leave. But if we're going to leave, you leave in a managed way. You leave with a plan. You don't leave with a catastrophe behind you. And what was done this year was a disgrace, absolutely unforgivable, leaving behind not only people that have helped us and people that needed protection and not completing the job of evacuating everybody, but doing it in such a way that we've allowed the bad guys to seize back control again. So I'm not saying that it's been a pointless exercise. There has been strong purpose to it. But we should have known better than to have handled it in the way that we did. And I have to say that President Biden really does have a lot to answer for. I think that the way he handled it was an outrage. I think that President Trump, had he been there, and I only wish he had been there personally, I think he would have handled it very differently. This is a humiliation for us, but it's also a betrayal of the people of Afghanistan that we were trying to help. It should have been handled differently, but what's done is done. We now have to face, I'm afraid, the very negative consequences of our failure to have a proper policy to deal with our eventual departure from that country.
Thank you. Alexander?
Well, I pretty much agree with that. I think I was the foreign minister at the time when we decided, as the UK did, to go to Afghanistan and help the Americans as our great ally. And after the outrage of 9/11, I often visited Afghanistan over the years. It seemed to me that nobody has ever made the argument that we would all remain in Afghanistan forever. And how many American troops were there in Afghanistan at the end? In any case, there are only about 2,500, whereas they have 30,000 in the Republic of Korea, in South Korea. They have a similar number, perhaps slightly more, in Japan, and they have been in those countries for decades. But they had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. If you wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, you have to negotiate your way out. And I always said this about Afghanistan, as I did about Iraq and other interventions that my country's been involved in. When the media say, when are you going to leave? I'm not telling you when I'm going to leave. I don't know. It depends on conditions. Our departure will be conditional. And the Americans should have made that perfectly clear, that they're not planning to stay in Afghanistan forever. But there has to be negotiated a power-sharing agreement. Okay, the Taliban might be part of the government, But given that polling showed that the polling in Afghanistan might be a bit dodgy, but and I'd like to know what other measures of public opinion people have in Afghanistan. But polling, and then corroborated by some of the people I've spoken to about it, showed that support for the Taliban was actually running at between 15 and 20%. You can imagine them having a role to play in the political process. And that should have been negotiated, and the Americans should have made it, Biden should have made it clear that they were the conditions on which we are leaving. So they just walked out. So the consequences that some people will tell you, well, it doesn't matter much, who cares about Afghanistan, we never thought about Afghanistan before. Well, you might not have done, but Afghanistan is important. What we've seen is three things which are really bad coming from this. The first is the China question. I mean, this expands China's influence and diminishes to almost to a negligible level Western influence right through the critical part of the world, Central Asia. So China has its Belt and Road initiatives going through Central Asia, down into Pakistan. China will now, China's not going to take over Afghanistan, but China will now be able to exercise substantial influence in Afghanistan. We will have almost none, of course. They talk here boldly at this conference about the British aid program going into Afghanistan and so on, fair enough. But I think, and the other point I'd make is that this is a huge win for political Islam. So right through the Middle East, the Gulf, through South Asia and into Southeast Asia, just as we have been winding back the influence of so-called political Islam, the hardcore militant Islamists, just as we have wound it back, so we have given them a huge propaganda victory. The Taliban can defeat the mighty United States of America. Honestly, did anyone think this? Does Joe Biden think these things through? I'll tell you who did. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, General Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. These people did think this through and did worry about it and didn't support this withdrawal. So, no. And it's an object lesson. Let us not repeat the humiliation of Afghanistan. Let us show more resolve.
Sophia?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's just such a potent example of both the kind of transformative power and profound limitations of Western influence at the moment. And let's be real, a relatively small military presence backed up by a very extensive presence of contractors, which, was actually sending quite a lot of cash back to the US, really changed lives. And let's spell this out. This is really about women. It absolutely changed the lives of the women in Afghanistan. And I think we have just been absolutely appallingly negligent to these women whose lives are now essentially, constrained back to a tenth, if that, of the freedoms they had before. And to give freedom and then take it away, I think it just feels especially cruel. So I think it's an absolute travesty. I think that we need to learn the lessons about what this means. Coming back to the point I was making before about, there's no framework for decision-making within, amongst G7 nations without the United States on these kinds of issues. Why do we have the Defense Secretary frantically calling around our European allies at the last minute trying to see if we would together be able to keep the airport open for a little bit longer? It's unbelievable that we don't have a framework for cooperation. So we need to absolutely learn these lessons. We need to accept that Trump was not just an aberration. His foreign policy instincts and the instincts that we're sort of seeing play out under Biden, although they are vastly different, they're both in many ways responding to much longer term trends. So the West needs to become more robust, more muscular, and more capable.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. The gentleman there got his hand up first, so we'll take his question first.
Thank you. It's Adrian Lee. Sorry, thank you. Don't normally get one of those. Thank you very much. I firstly would just like to say thank you for coming here. The Heritage Foundation is a fantastic organisation that is the pivotal organisation of conservative thinking in America that should have been listened to by that last, in my opinion, ridiculous administration that's now led to the disaster of this democratic presidency. The Heritage Foundation has to be praised, and I hope you come back time and again to the Conservative Party conference, because Conservatives here will listen to the Heritage Foundation, even if they've gone in the GOP completely haywire on other directions, because you really are pivotal to the Reagan Revolution back in the 80s, and you're so important.
Well,
So
I really appreciate the commercial. Thank you.
Thank you. And equally, colleagues of yours you may know from National Review. Again, sensible Conservatives that we need to hear from. I'd like to ask a question particularly to Mr. Downer. I know obviously he's based, I can see, at King's College in the Strand, but from his Southern Hemisphere perspective, one thing we're not discussing at this conference, although I have a terrible fear that we may be discussing it again in the future, is the Republic of China, Taiwan. At the moment, we are going through one of those phases where China is once again rattling sabres, and this is a country long since gone away from dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek to a full liberal democracy, and it's being threatened. And China openly says that they are looking to, at some stage, conquer it by military conquest, invade it. Are we going to allow that to be the Czechoslovakia of 1938? Is that going to be ours? Because we don't recognise it, because we ignore its existence yet trade with it all the time, that's going to be the pivotal thing. And I heard you said we're not talking about boycotts of communist China in terms of goods. We will be if they invade that, because we will be fully into Cold War if that happens. And so it's a pivotal thing for the West. We will not be able to cooperate with China, will we, economically, if they butcher 1 million or so people conquering Taiwan. So what is our solution? What do we do to protect Taiwan, to help Taiwan, and to care little of what Beijing, Peking, or whatever they wish it to be called these days think? Surely we need to stand up for the people in Taipei who are decent people and bound by liberal values like ourselves. Surely that must
Thank
be.
you.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't want to sound too bellicose here, but I think we need to send China much clearer messages than we have done. Remember, China has gone through 3 post-war, if you could put it that, phases, from 1949 when the communists took over. There was the Mao period, crazy stuff. Then there were from 79 onwards, the Deng Xiaoping period, up until Xi Jinping. So the Deng Xiaoping period, go easy, engage constructively with the world, liberalise the economy, encourage foreign investment. That was the period I dealt with, the Jiang Zemin's, Hu Jintao's and so on. Now you have the Xi Jinping period, the third great period of communist China. And this is a very ugly period. This is a very ugly regime, I have to say to you. This is not the regime that I dealt with when I was the foreign minister. First of all, I think they are economically incompetent, so I don't think the Chinese economy is going to keep rocketing up. Don't think that this is a country run by some brilliant technocrats who aren't making mistakes. They're making huge economic mistakes. But you see, gets to the point about Taiwan. What they're doing is they're turning the world against them. Their foreign policy is increasingly isolating their country. So at the end of last week, they've, it's China's National Day, and last Friday, I think it was, they flew fighter jets and bombers and things over Taiwan, Taiwan airspace, provocative, hoping, I suppose, the Taiwanese will shoot at them. So the message for a state, if you go back to the 1930s, the message for a state like that is, we're happy to engage with you and collaborate with you and trade with you, but there are rules, and don't break the rules. don't break the rules or there will be a huge price to pay, and it won't be, you know, that we're not going to sell them Scotch whiskey or something anymore. These trade boycotts are meaningless. A country like China wouldn't care whether we did it or whether we didn't. We have to make it clear, something really harsh, clear to China, that if they try to change the status quo in Taiwan by the use of force, we will resist that. It will be Armageddon if they try to take over Taiwan by the use of force. If you don't send that message, you just oh, we'll have a few trade sanctions and things. Why would they care? Honestly, a country of 1.3 billion people, second biggest economy in the world, why would they care? What would that matter to them? Couldn't sell any Huawei phones or something into your local phone shop. I mean, they wouldn't care. No. It is a casus belli attacking Taiwan. And, you know, that particularly applies to the United States. The United States has to make its resolve perfectly clear to Beijing and the United States allies. I mean, if they attack Taiwan, the United States, I think, will be forced to go to the defense of Taiwan. If the United States goes to the defense of Taiwan, Japan will. Probably Australia will. And there would be an expectation that the UK would play maybe not go to war, but play, I'm not sure, but play a really constructive role, certainly support the countries that are defending Taiwan. I always say, attack Taiwan and it will be a regional Armageddon. It'll be a regional Armageddon, so don't even think about it. And then they won't. Yeah.
I would just add in quick supplement that since Taiwan produces about 90% of all the advanced microchips that are made in the world, we would have considerable difficulty carrying on a war to save or liberate Taiwan for any considerable period of time. We might want to look into that issue as well. A gentleman right here on the aisle has a question. There's a microphone coming right there.
You discussed Afghanistan. Very few of what we've heard about Afghanistan in the last couple of months have mentioned the role of Pakistan. To most people in the UK, Imran Khan is just an ex-cricketer.
Very good ex-cricketer, too.
Does the West need to distance itself from Pakistan?
Anyone want to grasp the nettle of that one?
I think he bowls a lot of no balls and wides, actually. Used to be very good at cricket, but I don't think he's so impressive as a politician. I mean, and you know, he strongly identifies with political Islam. I personally don't think we've been tough enough on Pakistan through the 20 years in Afghanistan, because the Taliban were created by Pakistani intelligence. The Pakistanis could have done a lot more to rein in the Taliban, and for political reasons they didn't do it. They did some things, but for political reasons they didn't do it. Pakistan has become more and more difficult for us. And don't turn your back on India, you know. I think the relationship with India is proving to be really prospective. I don't think we haven't talked about India, but I think it has huge potential for the UK, as it does for Australia. And India is really looking to our countries and to the United States now in ways that it hasn't in my lifetime, not since Indian independence. So that's very encouraging. But, you know, don't get too bogged down with Pakistan. It's a difficult country.
I would add the quick observation that it is precisely during the years of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan that U.S.-Indian relations took a decisive turn towards better and broader relations. So, you know, entirely contrary to the narrative that being involved in Afghanistan led us to closer and closer dependence on Pakistan, on the contrary, that was the period that saw the U.S. turn from its historic tendency to side with Pakistan towards probably an inclination toward deciding and being more friendly with India, which is a transition that I thoroughly endorse. The question of what precisely you do about Pakistan, I think, is, well, I should disagree with Alexander, profoundly difficult. But I think we, at least in the U.S., has already started on this road, which is deciding that India is the safer bet going forward rather than Pakistan. I think we have time for one more quick question. We'll take the gentleman at the very far back there. You look strong and vigorous. Shout it out.
Well, looks to be deceiving. They certainly are. So we have in Germany thank you. We have in Germany a country that is now riven by political instability, potentially unable to form a government for the foreseeable future. In America, we have a president who is asleep at the wheel. And in France, we have a president who is more interested in looking at his own reflection in the mirror. So given this complete lack of global leadership, I want to ask the panel what they think could be the role for formalising a role for the Commonwealth across the globe. Britain used to have 25% of the globe under its rule. What can we do now to spread that influence, to unite with our neighbours once more in order to have a more formal role for the Commonwealth in order to combat China's neo-colonial attitude across the globe and to protect and preserve our Western values?
Well, I'll come back on that one. So the English-speaking world, the Anglosphere needs to do much more and move much more quickly to work together to develop stronger foreign and international policies. And the Commonwealth should be pivotal to that. Not that they're all English-speaking countries, some of them are, some of them aren't, but they all have a common heritage. And they want to be part of that wider Commonwealth family. And we've failed to utilise, I believe, the Commonwealth to do many things that we could be doing. So we need to prioritise, and RFCDO we now call it, they've never prioritised the Commonwealth. They've never had anything like the number of officials, civil servants that deal with the Commonwealth. The EU has dominated everything for decades, and the Commonwealth was, as Alexander spoke earlier about, foreign secretaries not even visiting Australia for so many years. They ignored the Commonwealth and treated it as something which wasn't worth bothering with. Well, we've got to change our attitude to that. But we've also got to, I believe, try and expand the Commonwealth if we can. I'm personally working hard to gradually persuade our Irish friends to join the Commonwealth. I think that would be a great step forward. I also think that, and we're already doing this, more in terms of defence cooperation, as we've seen recently. And then, of course, there is CANZUK, which I think offers great opportunities for the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and indeed our wider British family of territories around the world. So there's so many things we could be doing. But I think what we need is to shake up our Foreign Office in a big way. It's one of the unfinished bits of business from Mrs. Thatcher's time. She never really got to shake out the Foreign Office, and it's never happened since. I think we need to do that. And just quickly coming back on the issue about Taiwan, because I didn't comment on that, I personally think it's time to consider recognition of Taiwan and to give Taiwan full public support. If we don't give them some kind of recognition, we're hiding in the shadows. We have to now consider this actively. And Alexander's right, we've got to show China that we are not prepared to see Taiwan be obliterated by that regime. We will defend and support our Taiwanese friends. They were a beacon of freedom during that Cold War period. One of the very few countries in the world, in that part of the world, that was promoting freedom and democracy. And they still are. In that part of the world, there aren't that many countries that are truly free and democratic. And we have, I believe, a duty to stand by our Taiwanese friends. So let's give them recognition.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I thought for a second there that Andrew was going to propose U.S. membership of the Commonwealth, but he swerved away
We're
from
a
it.
bit choosy. We're a bit choosy.
He swerved away from it just at the last moment. So I want to close by thanking the Taxpayers Alliance, the IEA, for their support of the ThinkTent, thanking the panelists for their wonderful and provocative remarks, thanking you, the audience, for attending today, and wish you all an excellent conference and a very good next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
Really good. Thank
Wonderful.
you. Is that all right?